Hello everyone, welcome to our Bible study. Today we're in Psalm 18, and there's no time for my mumbo-jumbo blabbering today because we have 50 verses to get through. I think this is the third longest psalm in the entire 150 psalm collection. So we have much to cover, and it almost didn't fit on the outline, but I think we can get through it. How about that? We can get through it in a reasonable amount of time. Okay, first of all, who's the author? I'll give you one guess. The author is once again David, the king of Israel. And as far as New Testament references, I have one today. There's a second one, but I'm not so confident about it. The one that I have written down here is Romans chapter 15 and verse 9. That takes us down to our themes, and first of all, a little bit of context. We know a little bit about when and why this psalm was written. Psalm 18 is a psalm of worship written by David after God delivered him from the hand of Saul, who was the first king of Israel who was always trying to kill David. So then one theme that we're going to see in Psalm 18, God empowers his servants against evil and he trains them for battle. And then number 2, God's hand is with the righteous to give them victory. And then 2 definitions. First is mire. Mire the word appears in the English Standard Version in verse 42. It just means dirt or filth. It's not a word we use a whole lot nowadays. And then cherub. This one appears in verse 10. Cherub is the singular, or cherubim is the plural. If you're with us for our previous studies, you'll probably know what these are. Cherubim are winged heavenly beings that dwell with God in heaven, spiritual beings. In 1 Kings chapter 6, you may remember that Solomon had 2 images, very large images of cherubim constructed, and their wings stretched over the Ark of the Covenant in the temple's most holy place. Now, of course, as always, I really encourage you to read the chapter before you do this study, but especially today, because this psalm is very long. It's hard to summarize, and it's kind of unfortunate that we have to summarize it in some ways because the language is so unique, and David's praises to God they're just something that you need to read for yourself. Read them in the original words of the author. And I've included a lot of original words in quotes in this outline for that reason. But we're trying to study it in 5 minutes. We want to understand it, in the big picture. So let's do our best to break it down. Introduction is the first 5 verses I've titled it. David worships God for saving him from King Saul, which we just mentioned. Quote, "I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies." That may spark some remembrance in your mind. There's a very famous hymn which borrows those words as part of its lyrics. I will call upon the Lord. David was, he says, wrapped in the cords of death. All the threats of death were all around him, and yet God's salvation came through and saved him. Now, some of this really unique language that I mentioned is in verses 6 through 15, where David figuratively describes God's salvation. So definitely make sure that you read this section because my summary doesn't do it justice. I've included a few sections from the text here, which I just want to read to give you an idea of the way that the author is speaking. David says, quote, "In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I cried for help. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked because he was angry." That's verses 6 through 7. And then verse 10, quote, "He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind." And then in verses 13 through 14, David writes, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire, and he sent out his arrows and scattered them. He flashed forth lightnings and routed them," talking about David's enemies. Now, in verses 16 through 27, we're going to talk about David's righteousness and that God delighted in him because of this righteousness. So David attributed the Lord's willingness to help him in part to his own righteousness. And we'll come back to this in the application section because it might sound a little strange. We don't usually go around our churches bragging about how God helps me because I'm just so righteous, right? So when we see David doing that, maybe it throws us off a little bit, but we'll talk about that in the applications. David says, "The Lord is willing to help me because I'm a righteous man." He wrote that he tried his best to keep all of God's instructions, all of God's commands, and that he was blameless before him. Verse 24, quote, "The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. He delivered me from Saul because I'm a man of God." And then our last and our largest section, verses 28 through 50, God equips David with strength. So David credits God's strength for his victories. He doesn't, say it was his own power. He describes how God empowered him by being his shield, by empowering his feet to run like a deer, by being his strength and training his hands for combat. Again, some of that figurative language. God is the power behind David's success. This strength allowed him to overcome all of his enemies, and he writes, quote, "I beat them fine as dust before the wind. I cast them out like the mire in the streets," or like the dirt or the filth in the streets. David concludes the psalm with a couple expressions of worship. The first one you may recognize, also part of that hymn, quote, "The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be the God of my salvation." And then finally, in verse 50, "Great salvation he brings to his king, and shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his offspring forever." So now we go to our application section. Let's talk about David declaring his own righteousness, what he was doing there, and why we need Jesus. So the question, why do we need Jesus if we can just declare ourselves to be righteous like David did? What was David's intention? Is he trying to say that he's a sinless man? David said that God gave him victory in his battles against his enemies because he lived according to God's laws and his statutes. Now, David, we know, was not trying to declare himself to be a sinless man because he's already in previous Psalms that we've studied talked about his mistakes. He'll talk about that even more in the later Psalms. So he wasn't trying to say that he was a sinless man, but he did recognize that God blessed those who followed his commandments. This was a promise that was part of God's law that he gave to Israel on Mount Sinai. He said, if you do your best to follow my instructions and follow my laws, I will give you victory. I will bless your nation. I will bless your kings. I will give you victory over your enemies. And so that's what David is recognizing here when he's talking about his own righteousness, is that he's trying to follow God's laws and therefore reaping the benefits that God promised would come. So David's righteousness through God's promises brought him some success against his earthly enemies. But there was a greater enemy that David could not defeat. No man could defeat this enemy. This greater enemy was the one who defeated David when he convinced him that it was a good idea to take a married woman, commit adultery with her, and then to murder her husband. Satan is that enemy. Satan could rightly accuse David of sin, which is guilt before God, and that is a charge that's punishable by death. So no matter how many righteous deeds David did, he was never going to be able to escape his guilt, and his accuser, Satan, certainly wasn't going to let it go. So David could escape Saul, but he could not escape Satan and his sin guilt for other things that he did in his life. And like David, all of us have sinned, and no matter how many good deeds we've done, the accuser always has something against us. Satan was winning. He had the upper hand until God came and brought salvation to the earth. Jesus, who was sinless, died for our guilt so that we could be forgiven. He took away the accuser's power by taking the punishment that we deserved. He paid the price, and this is why Jesus is necessary. We might be able to win some small battles against earthly enemies like David, but it took the power and the blood of God to win the ultimate battle and to silence the accuser. David will be saved on the basis of Jesus' blood. The only way we will be saved is on the basis of Jesus' blood, which silences our accuser, who brings up our sin guilt before God, and God says, no, that's covered by my son who paid the price for him.